Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. Paul Henderson was a 62-year-old man with gentle eyes, thinning gray hair, and a steady voice. A former high school history teacher in Maplewood, a sleepy Ohio town, he had dedicated his life to teaching younger generations a passion for the past, the value of lessons learned, and the importance of collective memory. Even after his retirement, Paul remained a respected figure in the community. He spoke at local conferences, led historical tours, and occasionally wrote columns for the county newspaper. But since the arrival of a new little being in his life, everything had changed. When his only daughter, Sarah, gave birth to Ethan, something inside him had awakened, like a second youth, a new mission. It was a deep, almost sacred love, which had been formed at first sight. Paul saw in Ethan much more than a grandson. He saw an heir to everything he had loved, understood, and passed on. Every afternoon after lunch, Paul would put on his old Navy cardigan, grab a storybook or sometimes just a cushion, and go out into the garden where an old swing creaked gently in the wind. There, on the old wooden bench, weathered by the years, he would sit with Ethan in his arms. The seasons passed, but this ritual remained. Sometimes he would tell him American legends, stories of pioneers, or the adventures of Harriet Tubman and Martin Luther King. Other days, he preferred to hum old songs from his childhood. You Are My Sunshine was Ethan's favorite, and he clapped happily along to every chorus. That Tuesday, the air was fresh, scented with dead leaves and memories. The autumn sun, golden and timid, filtered through the orange-hued branches of a maple tree, casting flickering shadows like tableaux vivants on the ground. Paul, his back slightly bent, held Ethan against his chest. The little boy, dressed in a striped hoodie, rested his fingers on his grandfather's face, curious about every wrinkle, every grain of skin. Paul was softly singing to her a song he hadn't hummed in decades, an old tune his own mother used to sing to him when he was a child. His voice trembled a little, but his heart, in that moment, was filled with peace. But as he began a new verse, he felt something strange. A dull sensation, like too much pressure, began to build in his chest. It wasn't a direct pain at first, but rather an unease, a stifling discomfort. He first thought it was simply dizziness caused by fatigue or the morning coffee. He tried to reposition Ethan, to sit up slightly to breathe more freely. But suddenly, the pain intensified. It became a sharp burning sensation that radiated to his left arm. His heart, already weakened by an illness he had always downplayed, even to his doctors, began to beat irregularly, rapidly, and erratically. He blinked. Everything around him seemed to become blurred, distant. The garden began to spin gently, as if he were entering a dream too heavy. He wanted to call for help, but no sound came out of his mouth. His first instinct was for Ethan. Despite the silent panic rising, Paul instinctively tightened his arms around the baby, as if to protect him from a fall. He tried to stand, but his legs were no longer responding. His breaths became short and ragged, as if he were breathing through a narrow tube. Then he collapsed. His whole body folded in on itself, gently but heavily, like a falling oak. He slid slowly onto the bench, sprawling on the garden floor, still holding Ethan against him in a final act of protection. And it was there, in this sudden silence, that the unexpected magic of the bond between Paul and his grandson was about to be revealed. At that moment, everything could have turned into tragedy. The old man lay on the ground, his pale face frozen in pain, his half-closed eyes struggling to stay open. His left arm was still wrapped around Ethan's tiny body, as if refusing to let go, even in abandonment. The garden was silent except for the slight rustling of leaves in the wind, and this strange, almost unreal stillness seemed to suspend time. But in the heart of this stillness, an unexpected energy manifested itself. Ethan didn't cry out immediately. He didn't scream like an ordinary baby faced with panic. He sat up slowly, using shaky arms he barely knew how to use yet. His deep brown eyes rested on his grandfather's face. Something about Paul's silence, about this sudden, unnatural stillness, triggered an instinctive reaction in him, perhaps not understanding, but a pure, animal, ancient form of awareness. He stammered something, a jumble of confused syllables, and placed his small hand on Paul's cold cheek. But there was no answer. Then, With a surge that defied his age, Ethan turned. He had seen an object fall, a black rectangle, right next to the bench. The telephone. One of those fascinating objects his grandfather often held, which sometimes made lights, sounds, or let Mom's voice be heard through the screen. Crawling awkwardly across the floor, his knees scraping the damp earth, he reached for the device. His little fingers trembled, clumsy but determined. He tapped the screen, rotated it, dropped it, picked it up again. Then, in the childish chaos, his hand accidentally touched the side button. Once, twice, 3 times. The phone vibrated. The screen lit up briefly, flashing, then an automated message appeared. Emergency call, 911 in progress. Location sent. Ethan, of course, had no idea what he had just unleashed. But the universe, for its part, seemed to have conspired to make his gesture a saving act. At the same time, as if his instincts suddenly began to scream what words could not say, Ethan began to cry. But it wasn't a simple gurgle of frustration or a cry for food. It was a high-pitched, prolonged, painful cry, almost human in its intensity. A cry that pierced the stillness of the garden like an alarm in the night. A few houses away, a figure leaning over a bed of tulips suddenly raised its head. Mrs. Eleanor Thompson, a woman in her 60s with a maternal temperament and keen hearing, knew the voices of the neighborhood well. And this cry, she had never heard it. It was pure distress. She sat up, scanned the horizon, and saw in the Hendersons' yard a scene that chilled her. Old Paul, lying inert, and little Ethan, curled up against him, telephone in hand. Without missing a beat, she dropped her gardening gloves and strode briskly across the white picket fence. When she reached the bench, she immediately knelt down, checked Paul's pulse, faint, but present, then picked up the phone Ethan was still awkwardly holding. A 911 operator's voice crackled. "Hello, this is emergency services. We've received an automated call. GPS location detected. Is anyone nearby?" "Yes," Mrs. Thompson cried, panting. "He's fainted. He's barely breathing. It's Paul Henderson. He's lying in his garden. We need to send an ambulance immediately." As she spoke, Ethan, still huddled against his grandfather, had stopped crying, as if he knew he had done what he had to. His eyes remained fixed on Paul's face, and he whispered weakly, "Duh." This murmur, frail but tenacious, was like a breath of life in the silence. Help arrived within minutes, much faster than anyone would have thought possible in this quiet Ohio town. The ambulance, its flashing lights blazing, sped down the street lined with maple trees reddened by autumn, while neighbors, alerted by Mrs. Thompson's screams and the unusual commotion, timidly emerged from their homes, worried and silent. The medical team, led by an experienced paramedic named Jake Miller, arrived with professional precision but also with palpable humanity. 2 paramedics immediately took hold of Paul, lifting him carefully to avoid aggravating his condition, while Jake checked his pulse and vital signs. On the damp ground of the garden, Ethan sat motionless, holding his grandfather's hand with an almost supernatural gentleness. That tiny fist seemed to want to anchor Paul to life, to transmit an invisible strength, a silent promise not to abandon him. The paramedics exchanged a surprised look, moved by this gesture of a baby towards a man in distress. In the ambulance, as the sirens wailed again, the team went to work without missing a beat. Jake began effective CPR, applying firm but controlled pressure to Paul's chest, while a nurse administered medication to restart his heart rate. The hum of portable machines mingled with the rapid breathing of the responders. "We're holding on, Paul. Hang in there," Jake murmured, his eyes boring into the older man's, searching for any sign of consciousness. Meanwhile, Ethan remained huddled in the arms of one of the paramedics, his innocent but curious gaze following every movement. At times, he tried to reach out to his grandfather, as if he understood, in his own way, that the fight for life was underway. At Maplewood Regional Hospital, Paul was immediately taken in by a team of cardiologists. Machines flashed, monitors beeped, and a sense of urgency filled the white, sterile hallways. After a battery of tests, the diagnosis was made: a major heart attack, aggravated by long-hidden and undiagnosed coronary artery disease. Every minute had counted. Thanks to the quick intervention, however, Paul had a real chance. His fragile heart had been stimulated in time, preventing complete failure. The following days were a test of patience and hope. Paul often remained in a semi-conscious state, his weakened body struggling to recover. But every time he opened his eyes, there was Ethan, still there, sitting on the edge of the bed, or sometimes sleeping peacefully in his arms. This tiny being, so young and vulnerable, seemed to possess an invisible strength, an aura that lit up the hospital room and calmed fears. The nurses, often impressed, would comment to each other, "Look how he holds it. It's as if he knows he must be his grandfather's pillar." Paul, despite his weakness, felt this connection. Sometimes he opened his eyes just wide enough to see that innocent face, and a tired smile lit up his face. This smile was filled with immense gratitude, but also with deep emotion, a love that transcended illness and pain. In these suspended moments, the story of a grandfather and his grandson took on an almost sacred dimension, a moving testimony to the strength of family ties, the fragility of life, and the power of love capable of changing the course of destiny. Paul's recovery was slow, sometimes trying, but always steady. Each day brought its share of small victories, a breath regained, a step closer to independence, a smile rediscovered despite the fatigue. The convalescence, sometimes fraught with worry, was nevertheless brightened by Ethan's constant presence, whose simple proximity seemed to breathe new energy into his grandfather's weary body. When Paul finally returned home, it was like a triumphant return to the heart of the community. Word of mouth had spread. The story of the hero baby, the 1.5-year-old boy whose instinct had triggered the cry for help, had won over all the residents of Maplewood. Neighbors, old and new, flocked spontaneously, bringing homemade meals, fresh flowers, and above all, a warm, supportive, reassuring presence that enveloped the house in a soft, protective atmosphere. The local media quickly picked up the story. Reporters came to interview Paul, Ethan, and even Mrs. Thompson, the attentive neighbor who had heard the cries and raised the alarm. The term hero baby became a familiar name that spread throughout the region, etching the story into the collective memory as a miracle of everyday life. Articles and reports proliferated, often tinged with wonder, emotion, and a newfound faith in the power of family love. Yet despite this sudden attention, Paul remained humble, always quick to point out that it wasn't just Ethan who had saved his life, but the deep, unbreakable bond between them. A bond that went far beyond words, an ancestral and powerful love, an invisible thread that had guided this little being to place his fingers on that telephone, to awaken the emergency services, to give Paul a second chance. A few months later, invited to give a lecture at his old high school, Paul returned to his teaching position, but this time with a poignant story to share. Before an attentive gathering of students and colleagues, he recounted the ordeal he had endured. He spoke of the dark moments, of the danger that lurked with every beat of his fragile heart. Then, in a gentle but firm voice, he explained how sometimes, in moments when we think all is lost, it is the simplest gestures, the smallest acts of innocence, that can change the course of a life. He concluded his speech with these words, which resonated for a long time in the room. Ethan reminded me that love is the most powerful force, and that sometimes it's the most innocent who accomplish the greatest miracles. Today, life has returned to normal. Paul and Ethan continue to share their afternoons in the garden, under the same old bench, amidst autumn leaves or the soft rays of spring. But now there is a deeper gratitude in each look, a silent respect for this priceless gift, a second chance, an unexpected miracle born at the tips of a baby's fingers. The little boy grows up surrounded by immense love, carried by the strength of this unique bond. And every day, Paul savors this presence, this breath, this living miracle that constantly reminds him that life is precious, fragile, but above all, full of hope.